Chapter 9 and Chapter 10 both cover muscles. So, Chapter 9 is going to talk about how nearly half of the body's mass is made up of muscle and how it can transform chemical energy, which is ATP, into directed mechanical energy, which is going to be capable of exerting force. So, to investigate muscles, we have to look at the type of muscle tissue, the characteristics of it, and the functions of it. There's going to be three types of muscle tissue: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Then we will look at the factors of muscle contractions. Chapter 10 will continue on with an entire muscular system and how the action of a muscle can be inferred by the actual position of the muscle relative to the joint that it crosses. Now, I've got two videos that will cover both of these, and it's a great introduction to this chapter.
Hey, it's Professor Dave. Let's talk about muscles. When you hear the word muscle, what comes to mind? You might think about the muscles in your legs that help you to run fast, or maybe bodybuilders working on their biceps in the gym. These muscles belong to a particular type of muscle called skeletal muscle. But we actually have three different types of muscles in our bodies, and the other two are not as obvious. In addition to skeletal muscle, humans also have cardiac muscle and smooth muscle. So let's discuss all three of these types right now. First, what these different types of muscle have in common is that they are all vital for movement. Muscle tissue is predominantly comprised of muscle cells, and these are highly specialized for a process called contraction, which is what allows for mobility. The three types of muscles are quite different in their functions, but there are some similarities in their structure, so let's go through them one at a time. Let's start with skeletal muscle, as it's the most abundant. These are the muscles that cover our skeleton and give our body its shape. The exact number of skeletal muscles in the body is not precisely known, but it's thought to be over 650. These attach to bones either directly or via connective tissue called tendons, and they are responsible for a variety of functions. Skeletal muscles produce voluntary movements, which are the ones that are under our control. This includes simple movements like extending limbs or more coordinated movements like running or swimming, and they achieve this by pulling on the bones of the skeleton. Our skeletal muscles also maintain our posture. When you're sitting down, it might feel as though you're totally relaxed, but in actuality, many of these muscles are constantly working by making small adjustments to maintain your precise body position. Skeletal muscle even forms sphincters in the digestive and urinary tracts to allow for the control of actions such as swallowing and urination. Beyond these functions, they help us maintain optimal body temperature by releasing heat as a byproduct of muscle contraction. So what makes up skeletal muscle? We will see that skeletal muscle is different from the cardiac and smooth muscles that will be examined later, in that skeletal muscle cells are multinucleated. This means they have multiple nuclei. Cells called myoblasts, which have one nucleus each, fuse together to form a long cylindrical multinucleated cell called a muscle fiber, with its nuclei located at the periphery, and this is surrounded by a sheath of connective tissue called the endomysium. Inside each muscle fiber are many myofibrils, and these contain myofilaments, which are themselves organized into units called sarcomeres. These are the contractile machinery which actively shorten and are therefore responsible for skeletal muscle contraction. It is also these sarcomeres that give skeletal muscle a striated or striped appearance, and they are the smallest functional unit in the muscle. The myofilaments within are of two types: thinner actin filaments and thicker myosin filaments, and the sliding of these filaments past one another is what produces contraction, which we will discuss in more detail later. So that's what a muscle fiber is made up of. Now zooming out from there, each muscle fiber is arranged into a bundle of muscle cells called a fascicle, which is surrounded by a layer of fibrous connective tissue called the perimysium, and multiple muscle fascicles will in turn group together to form an even larger structure, which is surrounded by a layer of dense irregular connective tissue called the epimysium. This group of fascicles, along with blood vessels, nerves, and all the tissue, comprise an entire skeletal muscle, and these will span joints and attach to bones in at least 2 places. Attachments can be direct, where the epimysium of the muscle is fused to the periosteum of a bone or perichondrium of a cartilage. Or it can be indirect, where the muscle's connective tissue extends beyond the muscle as a rope-like tendon, or a sheet-like aponeurosis, which anchors to a skeletal element or other muscles. For a skeletal muscle to be able to contract, it needs to be activated or innervated by neurons in the central nervous system, and in particular the somatic nervous system, which essentially means the voluntary nervous system. We will learn about the nervous system a little bit later. For now, we can just understand that skeletal muscle is the only muscle type under voluntary control, which means these are the muscles that move when we decide to move them. Now let's move on to cardiac muscle. Cardiac means relating to the heart, so as one might guess, cardiac muscle is only found in the heart, and cardiac muscle cells are called cardiomyocytes. There is just one role for cardiac muscle, and that is to contract in order to push blood out of the heart to the rest of the body, which will supply tissues around the body with vital oxygen and nutrients. Cardiac muscle is similar to skeletal muscle in the sense that they also have a striated appearance, which is due to being comprised of myofibrils and sarcomeres for contractility. However, cardiac muscle is different from skeletal muscle in other ways. Cardiac muscle cells are short branched cells, which is a structure that allows them to communicate with other cells, and they typically have 1 or maybe 2 centrally located nuclei. In between each cardiomyocyte, there is an intercalated disc which contains gap junctions. These gap junctions allow the electrical stimulus that is required for contraction to rapidly spread across the cardiac tissue by allowing ions to move from one cell to the next. This means that the cardiomyocytes can contract in a coordinated fashion, allowing the heart to work as an efficient pump. Another difference from skeletal muscle is that we do not voluntarily contract the muscles in our heart, meaning that we don't consciously think about our heartbeat. It just happens automatically. This means that our cardiac muscle is innervated by the autonomic nervous system, which regulates the speed at which electrical stimuli are generated by specialized cardiac muscle cells called pacemaker cells. More on the autonomic nervous system later. Lastly, let's take a look at the third type of muscle tissue, known as smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is found in most of our organs, and it contracts to regulate many of our bodily functions as we go about our daily business. Smooth muscle in blood vessel walls will contract or relax to regulate blood pressure and the distribution of blood to our different organs. It is present in our airways to allow more or less air to pass through. It contracts in the walls of our digestive tract to push material along. The smooth muscle in our bladder contracts to expel urine out of the body. And it has numerous functions in the reproductive system, including contraction of the walls of the uterus to push a baby out of its mother during childbirth. Smooth muscle is typically organized into 2 layers. First, a longitudinal layer, where muscle fibers run parallel to the long axis of the organ, such that contraction will dilate and shorten the organ. Then there is a circular layer, where muscle fibers run around the circumference of the organ, such that contraction will constrict and lengthen the organ. When these layers alternate contraction, it can push material through the organ, a process called peristalsis. Similarly to cardiac muscle, smooth muscle is innervated by the autonomic nervous system, so it contracts and relaxes automatically. Smooth muscle cells also have a single centrally located nucleus, but they have a different shape than cardiomyocytes. The cells are short but spindle-shaped, which is referred to as fusiform. Interestingly, smooth muscle differs from skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle because it is not striated due to the lack of myofibrils and sarcomeres. Their myofilaments are scattered throughout the cytoplasm of the muscle cells instead. So with that, we now know a bit about the three different types of muscle tissue, those being skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. We can clearly see how these three types are quite different in terms of functionality, but remarkably, they are all extremely similar in structure. Now that we have a decent grasp on the structure of a muscle, let's talk about muscle contraction on the molecular level so that we can better understand this incredible process.
We have over 600 muscles in the body. In this video, we're going to look at 15 of those. 15 common superficial muscles that control the movement of different joints, like our elbow and shoulder joint. We're going to look at these muscles in terms of antagonist pairs, how pairs of muscles working against each other help us control each of the joints in our body. We'll learn some movement terms such as flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, rotation. We'll learn some origins and insertions, basically the points where the muscles attach to bones that they're moving. And we'll learn the difference between isometric and isotonic contractions. So we're only learning a small fraction, 15 out of the over 600 muscles, but we're going to learn a lot of concepts that go with these as we go through all of these 15. So let's jump to the whiteboard and get started. All right, before we get into the muscles themselves, there's several terms that we need to learn. We'll start with some movement terms. The first one is flexion. Now, flexion is any time you're taking a joint and you're decreasing the angle of it. So for example, whenever you contract the bicep muscle and that bends the elbow, that would be an example of flexion. If you do the opposite movement and you extend the elbow or increase the angle of that joint, then we call that extension. So flexion and extension are opposites of each other. Flexion is whenever you decrease the angle of a joint. Extension is whenever you increase the angle of that joint. And they're kind of opposite movements for most of our joints. And this idea of opposite movements gets into one of the big ideas of this video, which is antagonist pairs. In that example of bending and extending the elbow joint, we have an antagonistic pair of muscles. The biceps will flex the joint or decrease the angle. The triceps have to do the opposite movement and extend the elbow joint. If your bicep is contracting, then your tricep is relaxing, and vice versa. And so we call those an antagonist pair. It allows the joint to move one way and then back the other way, and it's controlled by two different muscles. These two diagrams demonstrate those terms. If you have extension, you're going to increase the angle between the humerus bone here and the radius and the ulna by moving the arm down this way. But if you flex that elbow joint, you're going to decrease the angle by moving your radius and ulna, or your lower arm, up this way, and therefore decreasing that angle between those bones. So those are flexion and extension, but we have other motions that our joints can do as well. One of those is rotation. Rotation is just going to be turning a joint, and usually when we talk about rotation, we need to indicate a direction, such as I'm going to rotate my shoulders medially, or I'm going to rotate my shoulders laterally. So we usually pair the word rotation with a directional term to indicate which direction we're rotating that joint. Next, we have the terms abduction. Abduction is movement away from the midline. So to abduct my arm, I'm going to take my arm and move it away from my midline. I think of this like being abducted by aliens, like you're getting taken away from something. It's taken away from the midline. And the opposite of that is a very similar sounding word, adduction. And I just think of addition. I'm adding it back to my torso. So when I adduct my arm, I return it back to my side or back to the midline. So I abduct the arm, but I can also adduct the arm. So even though those terms are pretty similar, I think there's a good way to remember them. Abduct and adduct. Those aren't all the movement terms, but those will be the main 5 that we'll use in the muscles that we're looking at in this video. Now, all muscles in your body connect to at least 2 points. Usually those are bones, and in all the examples we look at here, these muscles will connect to different bones in the body to pull on them and cause us to move. The 2 bones that the muscles connect to have names. We have the origin, and this is going to be whatever bone the muscle attaches to that doesn't move. The opposite of that is the insertion. The insertion is going to be the bone that does move. So if I think of bending my elbow as an example, my biceps brachii muscle connects from my scapula up here down to my radius down here. And whenever that contracts, it's going to move the radius. The radius is the bone that actually moves, so that would be the insertion. The origin is going to be the bone that doesn't move, and that was the scapula. Whenever I bend my elbow, my scapula isn't really moving right here. My radius is. Therefore, my scapula is the origin, and my radius is the insertion. Whenever I'm trying to identify origins and insertions, I find it helpful to identify the insertion first because it's easiest to tell what's moving, and then to go back and say, okay, what would the origin be that this could be pulling on to cause that movement to happen? So origin doesn't move, insertion does move. Finally, there's two types of contractions that we're going to look at. Those are isometric and isotonic. That prefix iso just means same. So let's look at isometric first. Iso means same, metric means length. So isometric means same length, and this is whenever you're contracting a muscle but no movement happens. So for example, if I try to lift up on my desk right now, I promise you this muscle is contracting right now, but nothing's happening. There's no movement happening, right? So that would be an isometric contraction. I'm straining really hard, but there's no movement happening, so it's isometric. Same length, or in other words, no movement. The opposite type of contraction is isotonic, and we're going to look at more isotonic contractions throughout this video. Isotonic means the same force, and this is going to be when there is movement happening. So for example, if I'm lifting up this book and I contract my bicep to do that, I'm applying the same force onto this book as I lift it up. Now, if this book were really heavy and I tried to lift it and there was no movement happening, well then I would be changing the amount of force that I'm trying to push up with. But if there is movement happening, that's happening with about the same force the whole length of the contraction. So we call it isotonic or same force. The main thing to remember though is that isotonic contractions are with movement. Isometric contractions are with no movement. So with all that terminology out of the way, let's actually look at some muscles. Whoa, this person looks intense. Muscle diagrams always look super intimidating, am I right? We'll move from the arms to the shoulder to the torso and then down to the legs. So we'll start off with this. This is the biceps brachii muscle. The action of the biceps brachii is to flex the elbow, and we've seen that in an example already. The origin of the biceps brachii is up in the scapula, and the insertion is going to be the radius. So it's going to pull between the scapula and the radius in order to flex the elbow joint. Now its antagonist is the triceps brachii. The action of the triceps brachii is to extend the elbow joint, or to straighten it back out. The triceps brachii originates at the proximal end of the humerus, and it attaches to the proximal end of the ulna, and it's going to pull on that ulna to straighten the elbow out, or extend the elbow. So biceps brachii, triceps brachii. Up next we have the deltoids, and the deltoids are your shoulder muscles, and their purpose is going to be to take your arms and raise them. Now raising your arms like that is an example of abduction. So abducting the arms is the function of the deltoids. The deltoids originate in the clavicle and the sternum, and they insert to the humerus. So they're going to pull like this to lift up the arm. Now the antagonist of the deltoid is actually two different muscles, which we'll look at now. First we have the pectoralis major muscle. The pectoralis is going to rotate your shoulders anteriorly. So whenever you contract these muscles right here, it pulls your shoulders forward. An example of a workout you could do here is a pec fly on a machine, or it could be a bench press, and you're rotating your shoulders forward whenever you push the weights out. So the pectoralis major rotates the shoulders anteriorly. The antagonist of the pectoralis major is the latissimus dorsi muscle. The latissimus dorsi is found in your lower back on both sides. Its origin is actually your lumbar spine down here, as well as your ribs, and it's going to connect to the humerus up here in the arm. And what it does is it's going to pull on that humerus back, so it acts as an antagonist to the pectoralis major. Pectoralis major rotates your shoulder forward. Latissimus dorsi rotates your shoulder backwards and sort of down. Or you could say it rotates it posteriorly. Now both of those muscles pull your shoulders down a little bit, either down and forward or down and back. So together they work as the antagonist to the deltoids, which abduct the arm. So deltoids can abduct the arm. Pectoralis major and latissimus dorsi together adduct the arm, bring it back down to the midline. Now another important muscle to the shoulders is the trapezius muscle. The trapezius muscle is kind of in the neck and the shoulders, back in this region right here. Its origin is the thoracic and cervical spine, as well as the base of the skull, and its insertion is the clavicle and the scapula. And the trapezius is all about moving your scapula. So if you move your scapula, which is back here, around like this, you're using your trapezius in order to do that. Okay, that feels good. I need to stretch out my trapezius a little bit. All right, from there, let's move down to the abdominal muscles. We have the rectus abdominis muscle, and that's going to be, when you think of abs, you're thinking of the rectus abdominis. This is your 6-pack, your 8-pack, your 10-pack, your 12-pack, bro. The movement of the rectus abdominis is going to be to bend the spine, actually. Think about doing a sit-up and your spine sort of bends. That's the action of the rectus abdominis, and that's why doing an ungodly amount of sit-ups could potentially maybe give you that 6-pack abs that you're hoping for. It connects from the anterior part of the pelvis right here to the costal cartilage of the ribs right here and pulls those together, which is how it bends the spine. So rectus abdominis, flexion of the spine or bending of the spine. Laterally to the rectus abdominis are the external abdominal obliques. They're called obliques because they're not parallel or vertical like this. They kind of run a diagonal, so we call those obliques. And the external abdominal obliques do very similarly, but they can also contract either one at a time, which can bend you down like this. So it's kind of like doing a sit-up, but kind of to the side. They have similar origin insertions, which are the pelvis and the ribs. So we've looked at muscles that control the elbow joint, the shoulder joint, the spine. Now let's look at the hip joint. The two prime movers here are the gluteus maximus. The gluteus maximus extends the hip joint or straightens the hip joint out. It originates on the pelvis and inserts on the femur. So it's going to bend that femur back or bend it posteriorly. Now, the antagonist of the gluteus maximus, we don't see in our diagram because it's an internal muscle. That muscle is called the iliopsoas. It's the antagonist of the gluteus maximus. Whereas the gluteus maximus extends the hip joint, this is going to flex the hip joint. And here's a picture of that muscle so you can see a little bit what it looks like. So gluteus maximus extends the hip joint, iliopsoas flexes the hip joint. Now we'll look at muscles that control knee movement. The first one we have is the biceps femoris, not to get confused with the biceps brachii. Your biceps femoris are also called the hamstrings. So these are your back leg muscles, and their job is going to be to flex the knee joint. The biceps femoris or hamstrings are going to originate in the pelvis and the femur, and their insertion or the movement part is the tibia and the fibula. So they're going to pull on the tibia and the fibula to cause those to move, or to flex the knee, to bend the knee. Bend the knee! Game of Thrones reference? Probably not. I'll edit that out. The antagonists of the hamstrings or biceps femoris are the quadriceps. Now the quadriceps are really four muscles. We have the rectus femoris right here, the vastus lateralis down here, the vastus medialis, and between those, deep or underneath all of this, is the vastus intermedius. Those four muscles make up the quadriceps, or your quads. The quads are in charge of extension of the knee or straightening your knee joint back out. And their origin includes the pelvis and the femur, and their insertion is going to be the patella and the tibia. So they're going to pull up on that kneecap and the tibia whenever you straighten out the leg. Now we've got another muscle here that maybe doesn't belong on this list, but I think it's a cool muscle, and that's called the sartorius. The sartorius is actually the longest muscle in the body, and it's going to connect from the lateral part of the pelvis right here down to the medial part of the tibia. And I always think of this as the stinky leg muscle. If you do the stinky leg, you got to use your sartorius. Do the stinky leg, do the stinky leg. Is that how it goes? I don't know music. So the sartorius will rotate the knee laterally. If you sit cross-legged, you have to use your sartorius to sit that way. It's a way to get your knees to the side. Last but not least, let's take a look at two muscles that control the ankle joint. The first one is the gastrocnemius, and that prefix gastro means stomach, and it has nothing to do with your stomach except for the fact that whoever discovered this muscle said, hey, this looks kind of like the shape of the stomach, and now we'll call it gastrocnemius forever. The gastrocnemius connects from the femur right here down to the calcaneus in the heel. It's going to pull the heel up, which will extend the ankle. Now technically we call this plantar flexion of the ankle because it moves the foot in the plantar direction, which is the downward direction or towards the base of the foot. But I also like to think about it as extending or increasing the angle of the ankle joint. Its antagonist is the tibialis anterior, which is named because it's connected to the tibia and it's on the anterior side. The tibialis anterior connects the tibia up here to the tarsal bones down here, and that's going to pull your foot upward. I think about this as flexion of the ankle, but to be technically accurate, we need to call this dorsiflexion because it's flexing the ankle toward the dorsal side or the top side of the foot. So the gastrocnemius does plantar flexion of the ankle joint, and the tibialis anterior does dorsiflexion of the ankle joint. Whew, this has been a lot. Let's recap all of these muscles, but not worry too much about the origins and insertions, and just focus on where is the muscle and what is its movement. We have the biceps brachii, which are going to flex the elbow joint. We have the triceps brachii, which will extend the elbow joint. We have the deltoids, which will abduct the arm or move the arm away from the midline or raise the arm. We have the pectoralis major, which will rotate the shoulders anterior, and the latissimus dorsi, which will rotate the shoulders posterior and a little bit down. We have the trapezius, which will move the scapula up and down and rotate the scapula and all that. We have the rectus abdominis, which will bend the spine like doing a crunch or a sit-up. And we have the external abdominal obliques, which do the same thing, but it'll help you bend down to one side or the other. We have the gluteus maximus, which will extend the hip joint or move your leg backward or posterior. And the antagonist of the gluteus maximus is the iliopsoas muscle. It's an internal muscle that's going to be a hip flexor that flexes or bends the hip muscle. Like whenever you kick a ball, you're using your iliopsoas muscle. Controlling the knee joint, we have the biceps femoris, which will flex or bend the knee. And we have the quadriceps muscle, which will extend or straighten out the knee. We have the sartorius or the stinky leg muscle, which rotates the knee to the side or laterally. We have the gastrocnemius, which is going to bend your foot down or plantar flexion of the foot. And we have the tibialis anterior, which will raise the foot or dorsiflexion of the foot. All right, here's a blank diagram now. Take a moment, pause the video, see if you can identify all of these 15 muscles, as well as the action of each muscle. What movement does it cause? All right, here are those muscles again, so you can check and see how many you got right.